So, good afternoon, everyone. Again, a very warm welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. Before I go on further, could I just ask that everyone make sure they either mute or switch off their mobile phones so that we don't get musical interruptions. I should do the same, of course. I once worked for a senior editor who always maintained the point that journalists shouldn't have press conferences. Journalists are recorders of events that the great, the good, and the rest of them sort of speak about. We record it, we report it to the public. One could argue that events that have taken place in the United States in the last few months, where I think we're all aware there's been an election and we have a new president and a new administration and a new cabinet being installed as we speak, that perhaps journalists do have something to say about their profession and the craft of reporting events accurately. We're now entering a world where we have phrases such as alternative facts, post-truth, and such like are creeping into our vocabulary. So it's with no apologies today. I do introduce a journalist who's going to speak to us, Mr. Steve Clemons, the editor-at-large at The Atlantic. And his topic today is the new Trump administration, its relationship to Japan, what we can look forward to perhaps, and also other issues to do with that. So if I can just ask again for a very warm welcome to our speaker today. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. It's great to be with you. I see a bunch of old friends, particularly my friend Nagata-san. You can go ahead and take a picture. And Okamoto-san from the Omiri and others of you. And I just have to say that all of you are looking so much younger than I remember. I also thought, when I was coming over to the Foreign Correspondents Club, and I love this club, when I was director of the Japan-America Society of Southern California, when I was later working for Senator Jeff Bingaman in the Senate, and I co-founded a think tank in Washington some years ago called the New America Foundation, is working in the old days with Clyde Prestowitz and the Economic Strategy Institute. In each of those roles, I managed to sneak my way into the Foreign Correspondents Club as a guest of one of you or as a speaker up here. So it is strange for me to be doing a press conference. I thought we would just have a conversation. So we'll hopefully have more of a conversation in a bit and go back and forth and discuss some of the consequential things that are going on. If you see me shaking a little bit, it's because I've been addicted to Donald Trump's tweets each morning, waiting to see what new distraction there is for the day. I literally woke up at 3:30 in the morning the other night, and there was something else out. It was on Donald Trump. Well, it was actually 5:30, but it felt like 3:30. But it was Donald Trump issuing a release on protecting LGBTQ workplace provisions, which was something that was not expected, but it was interesting that it was so early. But literally, you can jump onto his tweet or jump into the arena of the Trump sandbox and always find something to help animate your day. And just being on that plane for 15 hours was really, really hard. Coming over here, so I've been nervous about what I'm missing. I went to Bartlesville, Oklahoma recently. Bartlesville, Oklahoma is an old oil town just north of Tulsa. It's where many of my relatives and family live. I have about 100 cousins that live in Oklahoma, Kansas, which is just north, and also in Texas. 97 of those 100 cousins supported Donald Trump. And that's an awkward thing during, when I contribute for MSNBC, and I would hear a kind of a large herd of commentators deny that Donald Trump had a chance to win this election. I was one of those that said, I just don't see that. I don't feel that. There's something going on in the country. My relatives aren't all racists and bigots. I won't say that. Maybe there are one or two that might fit that bill. But there are other dynamics that I think were being completely missed by what I would call the talking head circuit in Washington and New York. And you could kind of feel when you got out into the reality of America that there was anger, frustration, pain, resentment at being looked down upon, at feeling demeaned by the Northeastern establishment, by seeing Hillary Clinton, before she began her formal campaign, spend $100,000 for a 2-week rental of a house in the Hamptons. Didn't get a lot of press coverage in the mainstream press, that rental. But I tell you, it did on the conservative talk shows. It certainly was very well known. It was the first thing that was brought up when I spoke to a bunch of students. What about that $100,000 house rental of Hillary Clinton? Something that very few people remember or recognize. But it just sent a tone at that time that with many Americans that I thought were missing. And so I wanted to put that out there, that I do have a connection to this crowd. I'm an independent. I want to be very clear about it. I'm sometimes wrongly called a liberal. In this, I remind everyone I was the first director of the Nixon Center for Peace and Freedom, of that Nixon, the Richard Nixon. But even Richard Nixon in this day and age would probably be considered a wild liberal, at least in national security affairs. The other joke I tried to play, and it completely bombed, on this issue of alternative facts and basically the post-fact society, as I said, it was where it finally broke for me is when Donald Trump called Theresa May a people person, which was demonstrably false. But yeah, no one laughed in Oklahoma either. In any case, let me just kind of walk through some of the things that I think are important to think about. And I say this, much of this is speculation. I think it's interesting. I should also say, so we make this a real press conference, The Atlantic just put out, this came out the day I left, so that would have been a day and a half ago. This is our brand new cover story. We normally don't put our cover stories online. We did in this case. We don't do it immediately. We wait a week and a half, but it is online as of a day and a half ago by David Frum, called How to Build an Autocracy. And in this issue, it looks at what the ingredients of stewing an autocracy are. It begins to posit a possible framework of what happens over the next 4 years, of how Donald Trump and his team sort of stumble into an autocratic, a very, very different, really an undermining of what we consider to be liberal democracy, or what I consider to be liberal democracy. It's a powerful and important piece that's gone viral on the internet now, so I recommend it to you. I may read just 2 short sections of it in a bit. But what I thought would be useful in light of Jim Mattis, our new Secretary of Defense, being here tomorrow, Prime Minister Abe visiting. I understand Taro Aso will also be going with him, some others, to meet with Donald Trump on February 10th, is to think about what's unfolding in the United States, but also what the impact on one of the most important alliances and allies here in Japan might look like and might be, things to consider, particularly given what we see Donald Trump doing with some of our other alliances. And I think that they are different. I can get into why, but I think it's important for those of you who cover U.S.-Japan relations to think about it. First of all, just let me run through some things that I think are obvious, but important. We used to call Donald Trump a wrecking ball, said that's what he was elected to be, and I have to tell you, as one of the kind of main pillars of D.C.'s cocktail party establishment, that's me, he is a wrecking ball, and he is coming in and he's making those traditional relationships in Washington, putting enormous pressure on them. Basically, one of the, I think, appropriate condemnations of Washington, particularly after the 2008-2009 financial crisis, was the structural corruption that led to that financial crisis. But things that look like cozy relationships between industry, between government, between insiders and other insiders, are those kinds of things which Donald Trump and his team with Steve Bannon and Rance Priebus are trying to undermine and put pressure on and to move in a different direction. They're doing it in an unusual way in their appointment of lots of billionaires to the cabinet. And that's one of the contradictions. There are contradictions out there. These aren't neat lines where if you look at the generals and billionaires that occupy the cabinet, that is some kind of an odd thing when you look at the fact that he's trying to say we are outsiders that have come in to restore a power to the people. I would add, just as a footnote there for a moment, that the appointment of many of those generals and admirals and billionaires doesn't mean that any of them will be significant to Donald Trump's policy direction or significant in his cabinet. You know, Barack Obama maintained power very much in the White House on all the issues he cared about, and most of his cabinet secretaries were ornaments. If you can multiply that by 10, then you have the current tension between cabinet secretaries and the appointees he has and what's going on in the White House. You've heard the stories, particularly about this recent executive order where literally none of the involved personnel, involved leaders had been consulted on that executive order regarding a temporary ban on immigrants from 7 Muslim-majority countries, 99% Muslim countries. In that case, you had those folks not involved, and I guess we are on TV and doing this, so I'll be careful here, but you know, I did go to the Alfalfa Club after party at Cafe Milano, for those of you who know the scene. Was hanging out there with people like Rex Tillerson, Gary Cohn, who's now the new National Economic Advisor, and a whole slew of other Trump acolytes, I guess, followers, who despite him not showing up, really love those scenes and are willing to kind of gossip and talk. And one of the things that I was able to comment and share, and I will do here without mentioning names, is that even those people that you would say are very close to the inner circle, on the edge of that inner circle, or people who are in line to be very important parts of the cabinet, are themselves mystified. They are mystified by Donald Trump's inner circle and behavior. And one of them used the term Keystone Cops. They said it's a Keystone Cops operation thus far, and I said that. And I also heard in that night, talking to a senior OMB, Office of Management and Budget official, that in this particular case of the refugee ban, what happens when any executive order is issued, there's a process involved. That process involves immediately beginning to look at the budgeting impacts, looking at the personnel impacts, beginning to coordinate for the Federal Register, all those kind of dimensions of actually actuating anything that the White House does. This is the White House clerk. It's the most boring part of the White House, but it's important. And what was interesting is to talk to an OMB official who was able to recount to me that they were ordered not to go through the process of beginning to share the executive order draft that they got with the other agencies and departments that would be impacted. They didn't get the order till very late, but nonetheless, they did have it hours before it was signed. And the normal process was that you begin to interact with these other agencies and departments. And what's important to know is that they were ordered not to do that. So when we began reporting this story, most of us began reporting it was they were moving too fast, or they're too inexperienced, or they're just, playing a politics of distraction of just racing ahead, or Donald Trump is too intemperate to wait and coordinate with everyone else, or there's an arrogance. No, but this was a different story. This was by design, that the chaos that came after that, the shock that came after the immigrant ban to some degree, that this was by purposeful and conscious decision not to integrate with the other parts of the rest of the government. And I lay that out there because you're going to see fault lines, right now we see lots of fault lines all over the place. The Trump quake is very big. There are lots of earthquake faults all coming together in one nexus. But what is happening, I think, is that you're going to have not only the Democrats on the outside challenging the White House, you have Republicans within the legislative branch and within sort of judicial land also questioning a lot what's going on. But what the most interesting ones to me are going to be the ones inside that White House, inside that executive branch, of tensions among people that are supposed to be considered loyal. This is the most interesting and I think undercovered part of the Trump story thus far, is the degree to which those people who look like Trump loyalists who've gotten appointments are not working together or pulling together. And I think that's going to be very, very important. I don't know what it means, but it's part of the erratic nature of what's going on right now. As we get into the question on Japan and thinking about what's going on globally in international affairs, one of the real drivers for Donald Trump when he was running for the presidency and beating and knocking out 16 other contenders was how he really understood the exhaustion that Americans felt over military service and how they felt exhausted economically. And the 2008-2009 financial crisis, easy to understand, bad deal, people felt screwed and left behind. The harder one that I have been writing about for 20 years, but I never expected someone to channel this current, was that those people in the Midwest, in kind of grassroots America, who'd gone off to fight in these wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, gone to do multiple tours of duty, had come home and had taken jobs at Hewlett-Packard or this company or that company, and then found themselves in strings of layoffs. The economic hardships and the feeling that the quid pro quo that used to exist for America in playing a global security role, but having a kind of net benefit economically to Americans, was palpably broken for Americans in kind of Trump America. And so that you could both be patriotic and you could feel angry and taken advantage of at the same time. And I think that is very, very important to understand about what's going on, to explain what Donald Trump and what his frame on national security issues, alliances, and this kind of shakedown that he's giving to allies right now. And I think that what he's trying to do when he was talking about NATO or Europe or other states doing more is trying to restore this sense that if the United States does do something out there in the world, that Americans are going to more visibly benefit from that, and he's going to want to point to those benefits. Now, that's a very interesting kind of mercantilism coming back into the game. It's mercantilism attached to the use of America's sprawling global capacity of power in the world. If you read my colleague Jeff Goldberg's article on Barack Obama called The Obama Doctrine, in that Obama talks about America's incredible capacity around the world and how other nations and actors regularly try to get us to do their bidding for them with our stuff. Donald Trump has exactly the same view as Barack Obama. Perhaps the most controversial thing that I get in trouble for and get more hate mail in my MSNBC commentary is that Donald Trump is a kind of, there's a word I would use, but I'm not going to use it because I know he'll put it out. But he's essentially the very, 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 very distilled, hardcore version of some of Obama's tendencies in foreign policy. The story of Obama doctrine is one of strategic restraint. The story of Donald Trump is trying to run away from really global engagement unless there's a clear payoff for Americans that he can show. That is what's going to happen. If you put Hillary Clinton in the world or Bill Kristol, you have this odd position where there are lots of the kind of national security establishment is all horrified by what's happening in the Trump administration because they look at NATO, alliances, understanding the one China, this kind of equilibrium that America has in the world is sort of mostly stable. Yes, the Middle East is a mess, but the Middle East is not where our future is. That kind of attitude is something that the strategic class in Washington largely agrees with. And where there are differences, where you get the neoconservatives like Bill Kristol or Robert Kagan or others, they want to go fight another war. Hillary Clinton wants to Americanize every other problem, out in the kind of international scene, and you would have Barack Obama saying, maybe there are some causes that are not American. Maybe there's some causes we just can't really weigh in and solve. And maybe we make them worse by being involved. So we need to be restrained and careful and cautious. Donald Trump is clearly on the other end of the line, and that he's not a realist. He's really on the edge of an isolationist. Some people have said a Jacksonian isolationist that will go out and clobber a beast, but then pull back very quickly to the castle. So I think that is a little bit of what's going on. I don't want to go on and on here, but I want to lay out the Japan piece of this. TPP was probably a treaty that the United States entered into for the wrong reasons. It was not an economic treaty. It was a geostrategic treaty that was initiated because of the feeling by Asia-Pacific countries that America's attention was not, and presence was not felt enough here in the region. And thus, it was designed from the very very beginning to fill this sense of void of American presence and trying to bolster up the certainty of America's engagement. And I was always intrigued as someone who's been in almost every trade debate since Reagan, that you did not have American companies muscling Congress to get TPP passed. Not many. Not the kind of wave of them you had. You had admirals and generals, former defense secretaries, making the strategic case for TPP. It was the military set that was buying the New York Times ads, not the economic set. And so TPP, in a way, became a poster child for that message back to the worker in Oklahoma or in Missouri or wherever they may be, that your interests, your economic interests, are constantly being sold out for America's strategic deals around the world. So you're yet again being screwed by America's global engagement equation. And I think that's important to look at. Now, I think that the way that means that suspending TPP, no matter whether you're pro-trade or anti-trade, gave China a gift. And this is where the kind of contradictions with Trump, I think, become complicated, become hard to understand, because he clearly has the desire for some sort of, sumo's the wrong metaphor, but some sort of contest with China, which is, he's taken on Fox News, he's taken on all these candidates, why not take on China? And TPP gives China a gift, while at the same time the demonization of China, the way in which he's framed a potential collision over the South China Sea, and a demonization as well of Japan along with this as a currency manipulator, which he just did this week. It's all inconsistent, because you see Donald Trump zeroing in on a country in a bilateral way, but then not looking at the synergies between these things, that if you are going to take on China, rile up, kind of deal with North Korea one way or the other, Japan becomes ever more important in that calculus to a rational and predictable strategic thinker. It's clear that Trump right now is not a rational and predictable strategic thinker. He has other things going on in his mind, and he's putting every nation that we have on edge, except perhaps Russia. It was interesting during the right in the middle of this this issue of the temporary ban on refugees and others coming to the United States, we made easier the visa process for Russians. That's something that didn't get a lot of notice here, but that's one of the things that happened simultaneously on the Russia front, not by executive order, but by other processes that had come out. So TPP is going to be part of the mix, because for Abe, and I don't think there's anything that can be salvaged from that. Many people think they're going to try and lateral over into some sort of bilateral trade arrangement. Anyone that looks at U.S.-Japan relations knows them well, and all of you know it much, much better than I do, know that really the only way to get a deal between Japan and the U.S. is in a multilateral context, because you've got to be able to trade across larger platforms than bilaterally. But maybe there's a way to do that down the road. And Trump doesn't seem to necessarily care about logic on some of these things, so maybe he could do that as a way to kind of give Abe something. But when it comes to China, North Korea, this currency manipulator status, all of this is tense. Yesterday, Donald Trump hung up the phone on Malcolm Turnbull in Australia. He threatened to invade Mexico, saying, we're going to take out hombres with the U.S. military. He called Germany a currency manipulator. It's just not a pretty scene. I talked to another deep insider in Trump land on New Year's Eve. I don't want to mention the person's name, but this person told me that when Abe desperately went over and wanted to meet Trump in Trump Tower in New York, they were trying hard to avoid the meeting. They didn't want Abe to get on the plane. They said we couldn't get him off the plane. We did not want to have that meeting. We weren't ready. This is according to an insider who did it. I mean, it sort of largely came off okay, but it set some people in the Trump team off in the wrong direction, and thought that Abe seemed more caught up in appearances and more caught up in this theater thing. They played along for that moment, but I'm waiting to see if the real Trump the more pugnacious Trump begins to show himself in the Abe relationship in February, or whether we're going to see a more grown-up Trump that understands that the U.S.-Japan relationship is a vital strategic foundation for U.S. security in the region. We just don't know. I don't know which way it will go. But the thing that has come to mind for me in talking to some of his people, and I have no idea whether they'll do this, but I think it's going to shake things up here, and it could be a major gift to Abe politically, is for Donald Trump to begin to publicly question the solvency of Article 9 and begin to sort of say, you know what, Japan is a weak country that is self-limiting itself, not playing its role, and it is weak. I can imagine that coming out of Donald Trump's mouth. And with what's going on in the region, you should be doing more. And it's not what you're doing for us and paying the United States 70% of the costs of being over here that matters. It's the own limitations you put on your own capabilities of dealing with your own neighborhood. This sounds to me like classic Trump. I actually think that it's going to be hard for him not to restrain himself and say that at some point. From a domestic political perspective in Japan, this is going to, I think, be highly volatile. But for Abe, it may be the kind of breath of fresh air on a topic that he really cares mostly about than other. And then I think that the question that many of you who know this arena better than I do need to know is if, in the transactional way in which Trump operates, is what will the United States want or get for giving Abe something that he secretly wants along those lines. And I think that the Article 9 drama is going to play out one way or the other, either February 10th, but in the near term, because it's something where in the overall plan of what Trump has, of pretending to muscle up, but he's actually this kind of shaking the foundation of alliances of NATO. You know, it's not entirely stupid, because he is shaking the foundations of these places, and he's making leaders wonder what they can do to maintain the love of the United States, the commitment of the United States, the hope that the United States will begin engaged, and they're beginning to look at scenarios of what they can do differently. And you're seeing it across every platform. I was just in Davos on Vice President Biden's last trip, took the last trip on Air Force Two with Biden, but Davos itself is worried about the United States and losing it, the bastion of capitalism as they see it. And they themselves are planning a DC conference, assembling the largest multinationals in the world to say, what can they do to invest more companies in the United States, to hire more Americans? This is complete command and control industrial policy being done at the behest of an intemperate new leader in the United States that is shaking things up dramatically. I could go on and on and on about invasions, Theresa May, what's going on with Europe, and the kind of complicated factors we have right now. I'll end with this sort of interesting moment of what I think we're dealing with, is that in David Frum's How to Build an Autocracy, it's all great, I recommend it, but he writes a little bit about what the Trump phenomena means, this I call it dark nationalism rising in America. I used to write about dark nationalism rising in Japan, and the absence of robust balancers and movements to contain what I worried about in Japan. All of that stuff I could write about the United States today. And you begin to worry about parties in Congress, particularly the GOP, acquiescing in ways that you never thought possible. You can look at companies that are beginning to kind of wave the flag on the migrant and refugee issue. But the robust response to Trump right now is not there. There's more acquiescence to what he's doing than anyone expected. And I've been writing, we were just talking privately, but when you look at the kind of things that Donald Trump could put together, some of the congressional and legislative numbers, either with impeachment, trying to end Trump, there's this sort of fantasy that people are going to be able to get Trump before the end of his term. I find most of this thinking delusional, because they're not looking at the nuts and bolts of the numbers and how people operate and the kind of of failure thus far to put up firewalls to some of what Trump is doing. So I worry that we're going to be in this period for a long time. But what Fromm writes is what is spreading today is repressive kleptocracy led by rulers motivated by greed rather than by the deranged idealism of Hitler or Stalin or Mao. Such rulers rely less on terror and more on rule twisting, the manipulation of information, and the cooperation of elites. And I think that's largely what's happening. When you look at the fact that the Trump folks just filed this week their final numbers for to the end of 2016 political expenditures, and Donald Trump spent $12.8 million in total on his own companies from the election, from the $8.7 million on his aircraft, Trump Tower, $2.1 million, Mar-a-Lago, $435,000. It gets down to Eric Trump wine manufacturers, $32,000, Trump Ice, $3,400, down to the Trump Cafe, $94. It all adds up to 12. It's an extraordinary list. I just tweeted it out if you want the whole roster of what they've spent on themselves in this particular election. Now, do I think it's all a kleptocracy? No, I don't. I think that Steve Bannon has a plan. I don't think Donald Trump has a plan, but I do think Steve Bannon has a plan, which maybe we can talk about in Q&A. And then let me read this last bit, though. And I think this is the big question mark for all of us that play this role in trying to create accountable journalism and accountable reportable audit. Donald Trump, however, represents something much more radical. A president who plausibly owes his office, at least in part, to a clandestine intervention by a hostile foreign intelligence service, question mark, who uses the bully pulpit to target individual critics, question mark, who creates blind trusts that are not blind, invites his children to commingle private and public business, and somehow gets the unhappy members of his own political party either to endorse his choices or shrug them off, question mark. If this were happening in Honduras, we'd know what to call it. It's happening here instead, and so we are baffled. That's the nature of the scene in Washington, D.C. And right now, particularly those of us who try to be in that credible track of journalism, but I would say even beyond that, the think tank sector, the representation sector, the NGO sector, is stuck between trying to figure out what a strategy of engagement is to try to achieve possible good outcomes, like what Jim Mattis is going to be over here tomorrow, trying to calm the waters and tell Japan everything will be okay, you're not going to have to do anything more, and nothing is going to change, when I know he has no control over any of those factors. Jim Mattis, as great a general as he is, and as a potentially wonderful Secretary of Defense for any other President of the United States, will have no latitude fundamentally on the course and content of that U.S.-Japan relationship, in my view. And so the quakes will continue to come, and in that role, I think journalists or those who are involved watching have to figure out how to keep a constructive foot in the game while at the same time waving red flags that desperately need to be waved and not letting them, letting you be harassed and cowed into silence and submission. So why don't I stop there and we can take comments and questions.
Okay. Wow is all I can say.
Was that okay for a press conference?
That was pretty good, actually, yeah. Can you come back again?
Sure.
So questions, please, if you can, when you come up, make your affiliation known. I think Martin was first. No.
Martin Kölling from Handelsblatt, Germany.
Hey, how are you?
Thank you very much for your speech. And my question is regarding the foreign policy towards China, Asia, the Asian strategy, basically. On the day of the inauguration speech, I think there was also the Senate hearing of Rex Tillerson, and the line that caught my attention was, "We will deny China access to the islands in the South China Sea."
Yes.
You said Trump is more on the isolationist side, but in Asia he really seems to
be more muscular, yeah.
To look for a showdown with China, actually. How far do you think he's really prepared to go on this road? I mean, if you really deny China access to the South China Sea, the Chinese won't like that. And
Right.
I think there were even voices in the
Look, I mean,
American military.
This is a perfect question, and I don't know if I have a perfect answer. It scares me because when you look at the kind of fragility that Donald Trump has cultivated, has helped breed in the international system, where every leading ally of the United States doubts the United States' willingness to be there for them in their dark times, while simultaneously going right at the most important issue of Chinese sovereignty that matters to them on the one China policy, hugging Russia, bashing Germany and the Europeans. I was in Kiev in Ukraine with Joe Biden on the day that Trump said, well, maybe we'll do a quick nuclear deal with Russia and then use that to waive the sanctions. I was in Ukraine. You should have seen the faces and attitudes and the kind of, the white. I mean, they all may be pale. I don't know, but they seem more ghostly pale that day. And so by what he's doing, he's making American capacity to do something like he wants to do in China less, and so is bravado, but whatnot. But I would tell you that there are 4 pages in Walter Russell Mead's book, Special Providence, on U.S. foreign policy, written in 2001, that so perfectly identify Donald Trump, the best writing I've ever read. That have nothing to do with it, but when you read it, you say, this is everything that Donald Trump is, from how he is on trade, how he is on national security, how he will muscle certain things, like you just used the China case, and yet use that as a cloak for greater isolationism and contraction, strategic contraction. And I'm happy to send you those 4 pages if you want to email, because I think it's useful as a template to begin thinking about something that, at least in Walt, and he was writing about Jacksonian foreign policy, which is unafraid to defend American interests on a moment and to go bloody the nose of another power, but then not to stay, not to look at the project as something that needs to end. The biggest difference between Trump and others is not his unwillingness to fight or deal with China. In fact, maybe that is a difference, that he may in fact be willing to do something along those lines, just like he may be very willing to send the U.S. military into Mexico. Who knows? But he's willing to at least say these things, even impulsively. But what is not the case is he's not willing to invest as much as he used to in sustaining everything that we did in terms of that global apparatus of power, where America could say it had greater intelligence capacity and greater ability to airlift power to every corner of the world than any other power. And so we were unrivaled in that. And many of us, particularly after the end of the Cold War, said that capacity now exists without purpose. And I think that tension over a purposeless capacity has driven people like Hillary Clinton to try to define what that purpose is, and people like Donald Trump to say that's a waste of your money, taxpayers, and to do it. So I know it sounds contradictory, but Donald Trump can be an isolationist and still threaten China at the same time. Not that he'll succeed in actually closing down their roots, but you have to understand that he's not worried about long-term arrangements. So I'll be less long-winded too, guys. I'm sorry.
Be as long-winded as you like.
Yeah.
Jake Adelstein from the Daily Beast and Zeitai Tenbo. You have said that Donald Trump is unpredictable and not rational. Be that as it may, what
rational in my sense, he may be in his own. So.
Yeah, true, in his own twisted way. What do you think he wants from Japan economically and politically?
I think he looks at Japan as a nation that got rich by cheating. And I think that his understanding of Japan and his deal-making was shaped not by Japan's condition and situation today, but the politics and the way many of us wrote about Japan's rise, particularly up through the 90s. And I think that is Donald Trump's frame on Japan from looking at global engagement. It really intrigued me. This is a sidestep from your question for a moment, but it really intrigued me that Richard Burt, our former Assistant Secretary for State, for international security, and he was the lead negotiator on strategic arms reduction treaties with Russia. It intrigued me that he tells this story. He knows Trump, that Trump knew him in social circles in New York, and that Trump wanted to be a strategic arms negotiator. This is a true story, and I won't use the I'll say F word, but Trump tried to advise Bert on what to do in those negotiations and told him to go to them late, don't show up on time, and when everyone's lined up and getting nervous, walk in, say F you, and then walk out. And Richard Burt has shared this publicly, that this is, of course, we didn't do that. But it reminds me that mindset that Trump has was from an era around that time of strategic arms issues with the Russians. Japan was showing us the way that power was not the throw weight of missiles. Japan at that time was the power of your economy, right? It was jobs, it was technology. I mean, the Japan young people know today was not the Japan that this club and others were reporting about in the 80s and 90s of this incredible rise. That is the Japan that Donald Trump has in his mind as one that he thinks cheated its way to success. So I think he wants from Japan compliance with his mercantilism. I think that America is about to become more mercantilistic than China in the way it shakes down big powers, big economic powers, big alliances, and begins to sort of make this question, however he achieves it, of jobs and investment in the United States as something he can point to as being one of the biggest causes that he has. And so I think you're going to see, he's not going to call it this, but he sees, because of what he sees as the mercantilism of Japan in the past and the mercantilism of China today, as more than adequate justifiers for his mercantilism that he's about to engage in. And he's going to expect Japan to play along with that.
Yes, the lady here.
I know I'm being blunt, but why not? Hi.
Thank you for taking my question.
Sure.
Kaorida with NHK Public Television, former Washington correspondent.
Good to see you. I knew I recognized you.
Really? Okay. It's a kind of follow-up from the previous question. So having said that, what is your advice to Prime Minister Abe going into his meeting next week with President Trump? And also, what is your advice to companies like Toyota, who's been trying to be a good U.S. citizen, investing in the U.S., creating a lot of jobs, but not getting a thank you Twitter like GM and Chrysler after making that announcement? I think the current strategy on the Japanese government and also on the private sector is be patient and try to explain that we're contributing to the American society, but it's not working. So what is your advice to Prime Minister Abe and to Toyota?
It's a really tough question because, one could look at the obsequiousness of Malcolm Turnbull recently. I happen to like Malcolm a lot and have met him, but Malcolm on this refugee issue essentially said, good for you Americans, we're doing the same thing. And, trying to curry favor, trying to compliment Trump seemed to be the recipe for getting on his radar screen. And the Russia model is a ridiculous but important one, where Trump continues to frame very complex, important national security arrangements and relations with other nations in a highly personal sense. So part of the strategy that Theresa May just used and was advised by Obama is to try to become his friend. Try not to challenge him. Try not to front him. Malcolm Turnbull was trying the same thing. And then when he kind of tried to convince him and thank him about those 1,250 refugees that America tried to take, Donald Trump saw red, went nuts, ended the phone call, it's supposed to be an hour-long call, ended the phone call, and went in and tweeted a comment about how idiotic it was to take those 1,250. So this has become the new kind of momentary distraction. One of the tweets that I missed while I was flying over to see all of you, and I think that with Abe, the question is what's on the agenda. Well, I guess the question is, Abe could flatter him. Abe could say, your love fest with Vladimir Putin is wonderful. We agree. Russia's talking to us about a pipeline through the, Sakhalin and others that, kind of bring that in. I'm actually being facetious, of course, but I think the bottom line is, when you look at Abe's DNA, Abe has, as I understand it, I know he's trying to cover it up a lot, but he has a natural predisposition against China. He's a national security hawk. His wife reported in a Wall Street Journal article that his guiding ambition is to repeal or completely gut Article 9. All of that can be framed, in a way in which there is what Trump seems to get along with is kind of this new nativist nationalism that's taking places in places around the world and respecting that. And I think what's interesting about Abe is going to make Japanese public crazy, and I apologize to all of you watching, deep down, I think Abe is very much like a nativist nationalist hawk that is so close in DNA to what Donald Trump wants to see rise in the world and abroad, that if he just stopped covering all that up, he's going to get along just fine with Trump. But what he doesn't get right is his desperate, that trip to Trump Tower made him look weak in the eyes of at least Trump's family and advisors. It made him look desperate for attention, not strong. And Trump judges people on whether they're weak or strong. And Abe, who probably sees himself as a strong guy, nonetheless is behaving in an obsequious manner, an obsequious way, kind of making it clear as it pops out from various people, from his handlers, from the Guy Michaud and others, about what the natural order of meetings ought to be between the United States and its allies. And Trump just looks at that as BS. And so I think that Abe needs to find his inner Trump, which I think exists there. Oh, Toyota. I think, I think that one of the other problems that we have with Trump is that, I think it was David Brooks who wrote the other day that said what you have now is kind of a growth of ethnic nationalism in the United States. And they don't like to call it that. They don't like to call it the Muslim ban. They don't want to make it look like this. But there is a moment, there's a period of time on the front end of this where there's a lot of pretend going on, a lot of code, that we're not going to call it a Muslim ban, even though General Flynn's son called it Muslim ban, and then in a fight with Jake Tapper on CNN said to Jake, don't you understand what a trending hashtag is? It's not really a Muslim ban. And he talked a lot about a Muslim ban during the road. So then they get up and Rudy Giuliani says, we were just trying to, I was asked to try to find a legal way to do a Muslim ban. And now that the White House is basically slamming journalists for saying you're pursuing a Muslim ban. We're not doing that at all, they say. So the same thing is happening in trade and economic policy, where they want American firms that are white, Caucasian, hiring white Caucasians, investing in America, coming back, drug companies that he just hammered the other day in the White House, bringing their operations back from whatever country, India they may be, and investing back in white America. Nobody says it this bluntly, but that's the code. That's code to folks for what's going on. Toyota doesn't yet fit that, even though I think many Americans would, think, believe it or not, particularly newer generations, that they don't know Toyota's Japanese. I mean, it's an interesting thing. But in Donald Trump's mind, shaped a long time ago, nonetheless, Toyota is part of that Japanese cheating machine, that came in and stole jobs. And there may not be a lot of public awareness. So, Trump is a shakedown artist in a way of putting people on edge, just like the story I shared from Ambassador Burt, and then coming back to negotiate. So I think Toyota has to withstand the initial assault and then to figure out how, either through its own public relations campaign, its others, what every major multinational operating in the United States has eventually done, and Toyota's done it in the past, is, Toyota's now moved to Plano, Texas. Toyota is an enormous employer of Texans in Texas that vote in Texas and that may have in fact voted for Trump. So telling how deeply Trump connected Toyota is, I expect to be in the PR roster of Toyota in the future, and I suspect that that'll be part of what happens. But right now, it doesn't fit into the kind of ethnically tilted code of what they're doing. And good to see you.
Oh, yeah, Siegfried Nittel, freelancer from Germany. America on the way to autocracy. But it's not, on the other side, a lot of protests in the United States. I went yesterday to a discussion with American scientists. They said one of them said there's a kind of a hope. He had a hope for a kind of a new movement like in the 60s to resist Trump.
Yeah, I think that there's another article in this by Jonathan Rauch, who's a great writer, about how important it is for civil society to begin figuring out what structures work and don't work in resisting or containing. It's an article called "Containing Trump." But I'm going to be blunt here. I mean, I don't. Right now, I don't see much success from any of the major players in there. I see a tendency. This is when the hate mail really comes in, of the progressive left to spend a lot of time fighting over the wrong things and fighting amongst each other, as opposed to being more strategic in how they deal with this. Now, that said, the protests that rose all around the United States, in many places around the world, both the women's marches and women's protests all over the world, what happened in the airports the other day, was extraordinary because it was instantaneous and not organized. And I'm sure that it hit a chord inside the Trump White House. That being said, I happen to know that people inside the Trump White House, I know this for a fact, looked at what was going on in the airports as something to celebrate, because it showed my relatives in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, that Trump was the wrecking ball in doing what he promised to do. So you need to understand that while you see these protests and people need to kind of get back into that feeling, you talk about the 1968, 67 protests, that there was a sense of empowerment that people got out there. And I do think that that's brewing in the left and center left in the United States. But I also see, I mean, I don't want to go into the personal side of it, but I've seen where I have said something on television at one point or another about Hillary Clinton that I thought was, in my world, fair and something her campaign would have said, but the kind of raging issues we have now with political correctness resulted in my getting about 20,000 hate tweets from people who supported Hillary Clinton. Believe me, if they're targeting me, it's a waste of energy and time and the wrong target, right? So, one of the interesting challenges, I think, in that is how to organize effectively, and we haven't seen that in a long time. I also get down to this issue, a lot of people talk about impeachment because there's so much self-dealing that seems to be possible under Trump and maybe even imminent and even happening now from a legal perspective. And the question is, I tell everybody, it's always interesting to sort of hypothesize what you could lay out as a case. I think that our tolerance for crime, criminal behavior, what you would call criminal behavior or misdeeds, has gone way up in terms of what we're willing to consider a crime is very different than what it would have been in 1971 with Nixon. But you've also got to look at the votes. And while there are only 52 Republicans in the United States Senate, those 52 are fairly solid. Now, we just saw 2 Republicans for the first time oppose any of the candidates that Donald Trump came out. That's one is not really a Republican anymore. That's Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, who's officially an independent, and then Susan Collins opposing Education Secretary Betsy DeVos. And in that case, it's going to be interesting to see whether Trump lets it stand, whether he cares about Betsy DeVos, wants to have a fight over education, and spends time harassing and threatening and challenging those two. Because that's going to be the issue of whether people can get away on the GOP side of challenging Trump. I've seen Trump humiliate Paul Ryan and take Paul Ryan down, who was the star of his party. I've seen him. It was impossible. Anybody with Fox News here? Anybody with Fox? It was impossible to become president of the United States without the full blessing and adoration of Fox News. And we saw this weird thing where Donald Trump battered down Fox News, and then Sean Hannity, who went into a love fest with Trump, went to #1. Megyn Kelly, who challenged Trump on a variety of fronts. Her show went to number 5 on air. And so you've got this powerful current right now where even people on the right that are around him who have very principled views to stand up against him are very, very afraid of challenging him. And so as long as that remains the case, there is no chance for impeachment. It's delusional. So you can have a lot of protests, you can have a lot of argument from the left, but thus far, and I don't mean to be so blunt, I find it largely ineffective and targeting the wrong waves. If I were, and I'm not saying I'm advocating this as a journalist, I'm an opinion journalist, but if I were to put resources into this and give advice, as I was just being shared with Abe on how to make the world a safer, better place, I'd stop talking about Trump. I don't think, Trump is president of the United States. Trump has issues. Trump doesn't know the job. He's a businessman who came in. He has zero experience in this. Give him some time. The guy who's calling the shots, who's rising to fill the void, is Steve Bannon. And while more and more people are beginning to learn about Steve Bannon, we know almost nothing about him. His life has not been scraped through like many of the others. And he's not, he was just raised to be a permanent member of the National Security Council staff. I was reading this executive order online on MSNBC, and I couldn't quite believe it because I was reading the strategic advisor for the president was in the permanent 5, and then there's a line on how the director of national intelligence and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff would be called as necessary. And anybody who follows national security and intelligence sort of world was just sort of, I remember being on air, I just started stuttering. I said, this can't be right. I didn't catch, in fact, that the CIA wasn't even mentioned because, CIA is technically subordinate to the DNI. But now Trump has done this weird thing saying he'll amend the executive order, put Mike Pompeo and the CIA onto it, but leave the DNI and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff on an optional basis, and did all of this without consulting any of the players. So this is Steve Bannon, who now will be the political commissar by executive order in every meeting. This is extraordinary. That is what protesters and others should be about and thinking about.
Sir, over here.
Hi,
Do I out you or not out you?
don't out me.
Okay.
I'm Tony Miller. I'm a
Yeah.
guest.
Yeah.
We have a mutual friend. And I'm from the private sector. I'm in the fund management business in Japan. I'm glad you brought up Steve Bannon. Is it possible that we're giving Trump way too much credit, that in fact he doesn't have a strategy or even a set of policies, that all his policies, with the possible exception of Russia, just seem to be the policies that he thinks that his core supporters support, that he's had different policies over his lifetime, and that these policies that he talks about as if they're his policies are just things that he wants his core constituency to see him doing, which creates a different dialectic. That means you just want to
You want to hijack him.
or you want to please him superficially, but it doesn't really matter what happens. However, Steve Bannon does have a strategy and does have a system.
Steve Bannon has compared himself to Lenin. He has a vision.
Or Rasputin, I'm not
Yeah.
sure.
But no, he has personally compared himself and stated, I'm Lenin.
Thomas Cromwell also.
Yeah.
So what does Steve Bannon think, and what should we be doing to prepare ourselves for that, if you believe that analysis?
I think that, just short form, I think that Steve is a player and represents and is close to, I want to be careful of calling him a white supremacist. I think he flirts with a lot of white supremacists. I think he's a businessman who understands that and a movement man who understands that this notion that America has been playing a role in the world and has sold out its own people is very powerful, and he saw it in the Breitbart operation, and I think he's been thinking about it a long time. And there's some legitimacy in some of that. I remember working with Clyde Prestowitz and others in the Economic Strategy Institute who were worried about trade deals that were sort of selling out U.S. interests. Or you would, go back, and there's a guy who was on the CIA Oversight Review Committee, he's spoken here before, some of you may know, named Michael Schaller at the University of Arizona, wrote a book on U.S.-Japan relations called Altered States, where he went through declassified CIA documents to look at the number of times America had made arrangements with Japan for strategic reasons, but there were economic, costs or net negatives on the U.S. side. So you can look at all that theoretically. What I think the Bannon crowd got is that they began to feel in this kind of amorphous group of angry, uneducated or lesser educated, what we call the groups left behind, but some of whom Hillary Clinton labeled, rightly or wrongly as deplorables, but the kind of pugnacious South that felt like, blacks and Hispanics were bringing drugs and crime into their communities, getting favoritism. There was a zero-sum sense between various groups in the United States on the ethnic front that were there. And I think Bannon has animated that and is creating a massive political movement, just like Marie Le Pen in France and others. I think it's completely characteristic of all of that. Trump, I've met him 3 or 4 times. Nothing particularly deep. You had engagements with him. In my engagement with him before he ran for president, I never saw anything too nefarious, except the birther campaign about Obama's birth certificate was, I think, Trump's orientation to the power of this crowd and what it could be done to keep yourself in the headlines. Then is his own experience with reality TV and his ability to kind of keep himself in the headlines every day, and Hillary Clinton's lack of ability to keep herself in the headlines every day, that kind of created this momentum. And that crowd, so it's not all Bannon, but it's a lot Bannon now. What I fear, and it's interesting because Bannon he does matter a lot. He matters more than most of us thought he would. But because we thought people like Reince Priebus and Michael Flynn, General Michael Flynn, the National Security Advisor, would matter more than they are. But from what I'm reading from interior accounts, and you and I know some of the same people, Reince has become kind of a weaker player in the middle of things. He was perceived to be strong before the inauguration day. Now he's perceived to be very weak. Mike Flynn is being reported increasingly of concern to Bannon, where Bannon is stepping more to these national security issues because of his own view that Flynn is weak and incompetent. Now I'm speculating, and this is hearsay largely from other reporting. I don't know if it's true. But I do know that you see brewing, and I did report this other night on TV that Alfalfa Club dinners are important because you get to hear gossip, and sometimes you get to hear gossip from the principals. And in the case of the principals, after the Alfalfa Club dinner, when these executive orders were coming down, those 3 executive orders, you heard so many Trump insiders just casting, they felt embarrassed by what was going on by the White House, and they had incredible disdain for their colleagues that worked for Trump. And that was extraordinary, just extraordinary. It means that we're in for a lot of trouble.
So where is Bannon taking us?
I think we're going to see a mercantilist, ethnic nationalist impulse, and that's where he's taking us. On immigration, on everything. That's where we're going. No reason to pull back now.
Okay. And
I'll be faster. Nagata-san,
on the front here.
Yeah.
Hello, my name's Harry Sugiyama Scott Stokes. I'm a freelancer, but also welcome Japanese TV and radio.
Yeah.
It's great to have you here. Thanks for
Nice to
popping
see you,
along.
thank you.
Executive orders.
Yes.
What we've seen with the refugee ban, but also with TPP too. What should we expect in the near future, and also in the perspective of the Japanese man and woman? What could be exceptionally relevant? I hate for you to hypothesize, but if you could give us a little cheeky look into the near future, that'd be lovely.
Well, I don't know if we'll see executive orders on Japan unless he gets some issue going with Abe that goes the wrong direction. So I just don't, right now I don't see it. What I see the next set of executive orders on are things like religious liberty, which is a way to go after the LGBT community right after you promise to protect the LGBT community. Though these are domestic things, immigration, other elements of the sort of the dreamers, because when you look at the Donald Trump, now this is remarkable because we've never had a president, I remember when Barack Obama was running against Mitt Romney, both of them were constantly demonizing China. Almost no one remembers this, but I wrote a lot about it, and I'm so pissed off that I spent so much time writing about it because neither one did anything with currency. They said, day one, we're going to announce China as a currency manipulator. It was all kind of baloney. And it's what they thought the public needed to hear. So there was this gap between what was said on the campaign trail and that what was, actuated in when they came into office. Donald Trump put out a contract. Go back and look at it. I'll email it to you if you like. It's line by line. Here are the things I'm going to do on day one. And almost no one in the punditry community believed that any of it was doable. No one thought it was doable. They all thought he was going to walk away from it. And I got to tell you, he is going line by line by line by line. And as crazy as some of these things are, and as impolitic as you would think they would be, he's doing them, and he's getting credit for doing them. And I can tell you, Japan does not appear on that list, so Japan is okay for a little while. But in the next wave, but the thing about executive orders is very interesting. But let's talk about that just for 2 seconds. The classic Republicans in Congress and many Democrats hated Barack Obama's executive orders. Richard Blumenthal, I interviewed Senator Richard Blumenthal about them, and he thought that it might be true that, in fact, Barack Obama was overstepping his authority in a number of ways, and that this would need to be run through a congressional debate with the country because the president was clearly overreaching in some areas. That was from a Democratic Senate colleague. No one expected Donald Trump to come in and make a theater show, a TV show. I mean, on Mike Spence's daily report of what he's going to do, it says, I'm going to the White House for executive order signing. I mean, that's never happened before in readouts from the White House. It's never been a thing. You've never had the show, we're going to show the executive orders. And it's important, because Donald Trump has already decided that this is the way he can outperform Congress and be a foil against Congress's ineptitude and its inability to do anything. He's got 52 votes in the U.S. Senate. And, I led the battle when I was in think tank land, not a journalist, against John Bolton's confirmation vote in 2005 when he was nominated by George Bush to serve as the UN ambassador. And he never got that confirmation vote. And the Republicans controlled the White House, the Senate, and the House. And he was beaten by Republicans. And I helped work that way all the way, because we beat him. I mean, I won't go into the details of it, but we beat him because we only needed 41 votes in the rules of filibuster then. The Democrats gave that up on executive appointments and on legal and judicial appointments and everything except the Supreme Court. Now with the nomination of a new Supreme Court justice, they're now talking about changing the rules again so that we have a majority vote on that. So on these appointments, you're going to do it. But what's interesting is on legislation and policy, the filibuster still exists. And that means that any piece of legislative initiative will be litigated. And you're going to be litigating from a very weak position in the House. That means you're going to be constantly 9 votes short on securing cloture. And in that case, that's a very big hurdle for Trump to get. And so this executive order issue, whatever it's going to be, is going to become a regular feature of this government. And I imagine that by the end of his 4 years, he will have written enormous numbers of executive orders and usurped incredible authority, unless you begin to see a pushback by John McCain, Lindsey Graham, certain other legislators that begin to band together and decide they're going to shut Trump down. And they do that at their peril. But John McCain just won election again. You've got you've got 2 key senators up in 2018 that are in this mix too. But it's when you're in that area and you're going to get back to the nuts and bolts of numbers, it's very hard for this. And then in the next election in 2018, I don't know if these numbers are exactly right, so forgive me if I'm wrong, but I think there are 11 Democrats or 11 Republicans that are up and 22 Democrats, which means that the vulnerability of Democrats next time is super high, twice as much as it is to Republicans. And the Republicans are likely to actually make greater inroads of increasing their numbers in the next Senate roundup rather than lose them. even with what Trump is doing. So the next 2 years, executive orders are going to be there, and so on the whole bunch. But I don't expect any on Japan unless Abe really makes him crazy.
Calvin? Yeah.
Are you guys having fun?
Yeah.
I hope I'm not. Yeah.
Actually, can I just check with you on time? Are you okay? It's 4:11.
I don't know. For me, it's like 2 in the morning.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's fine.
All right.
Thank you, Khaldun Azari, Panoramic News.
Yes.
I will follow your advice and I will not ask about Trump.
Okay.
So what is your advice or what is your prospects on Japan's relations and confrontation with China and North Korea? And how do you expect the situation in the coming years? Because you said Abe is very nationalistic and he's follow his own agenda. Thank you. I mean, the vision in Washington, D.C.
Look, I mean, I think it's really, we had a more ordered world at one point, even with the tension in the world, that is now slowly eroding. It was not slowly, quickly eroding and collapsing into something else. I was in Davos when Xi Jinping basically took over the place. I don't know if any of you followed that. Was anybody else in Davos? It was extraordinary, right? China is the story, the whole story. You had this remarkable situation where in the pining for America to be like it used to be, and it's clearly not going to be. And my friend Joe Biden talking about cancer and kind of saying, inequality is important in the world. Xi Jinping rose up and said, don't worry, I will protect the global environment. I will protect the global trading system. And so you had Xi Jinping rising to say, we will be the adult in the room, the adult in the world to help stabilize and do these kinds of things. So you either buy that or not. I think people like the vice president think, I'm speculating here, think that China doesn't have the capacity to do the things that it said it would do in Davos, but that aside, when it comes to Japan, which actually is an extraordinarily wealthy, capable country, you start with say global environmental issues and the Kyoto protocols, and on, and Japan's importance in energy and technology and innovation and health research and just across the board capabilities. One of the things that I think Japan is kind of the forgotten vital country. It's the neglected ally, and I have to tell you that one of my, since I'm pissing off everybody, might not do one more. When Ryozo Kato was the ambassador of Japan to the United States during 9/11, Japan had a brewing battle with the United States at the WTO on certain steel issues. And we had a brewing issue with Japan, and in part was related to an article I'd written about historical memory and a provision dealing with POW lawsuits. And what's interesting is that POW lawsuit provision, which at that time was brewing in California courts and important, legislation came up in the House and Senate that was sidelined. And it was only 7 times in U.S. history that a piece of legislation that had passed simultaneously, same language in the House and Senate in the same appropriations bill, came forward, and that was set aside by the committee because of the global war on terror and the importance to preserve the alliance. It was set aside. The WTO complaint from Japan was set aside. And I had a public meeting with Ryozo Kato, who said, we are going to fly beneath the radar screen. We're only going to be supportive of the United States. And I said, then you're going to disappear in the priority list to Americans. I said, you have to realize that Japan's status with Congress, the visit from members of Congress to here, that your status as a nation in the eyes of Americans is not based on how good you are, but how bad you have been, or how bad you are to us. That the tension, that the consequential engagement of Japan and the United States made Japan feel important, made Japan feel, not that made you feel, from Americans' eyes, that Japan was a significant, consequential player that often challenged the United States, often collaborated with the United States. But if you took the challenge part out, I said you're going to be forgotten. And that's exactly what's happened. And I'll never forget that exchange with Ambassador Kato, because I said, I worked with the Congress and the Senate, I'm familiar with these things, and everyone involved with Japan, even your best friends, the Bill Bradleys, the Joe Liebermans, the others, all have had issues there, and your weight is based not only the good things you can do, but the trouble you can make. And I think that Abe has to play that same game, and Japan has not been playing that. That the mistake is becoming a lapdog into Trump's mind. That if he just positions Japan as this, obsequious country willing to play in Trump land, I think you run the risk of actually becoming considered and remaining, at least from a perceptual basis, unimportant in the eyes of America, when I know that Japan is vastly important. So when you begin emerging on climate, you begin emerging on these other issues, then you become part of Donald Trump's view that this is strength here, and that's the way to kind of largely begin dealing with China. Now, say that doesn't work, then I think you've got to go into the Angela Merkel court. Angela Merkel said to Europe, I guess we're on our own. We've got to begin thinking in different ways. And that's going to mean that, one of the things and that I've said controversially in the past, and I don't know how strongly I view what I'm about to say, but why not say it? To a certain degree, U.S. security in the Asia-Pacific region has created a moral hazard problem for Korea, China, and Japan, where they've all been able to be obsessed with national memory issues, cultural disdain for each other, and to take it to kind of a weird nationalistic level in each country because they knew ultimately the United States was the buffer that would tolerate that bad behavior. That you could go to Yasukuni, or you could, with previously President Pak, have a tiff over a variety of issues that dealt with things and not reasonably manage them because you didn't have to. And the United States would force you to talk, force you to deal with it, and no real collisions would happen. Now, what happens if you withdraw that U.S. buffer, and the U.S. buffer is less dependably keeping order with that tension? Then it means that people have to be accountable for this historical memory stuff, and they have to be, for their disdain. And so that's another interesting challenge for Abe with China, of whether or not his hawkishness helps or hurts. Who is the guy, your former prime minister, who went to play baseball with Wen Jiabao? He could be a little bit more like that. Fukuda, after Taro Aso. So many prime ministers, so little time. What's it? No, it was not Hatoyama. Yeah, so it was Fukuda. So Fukuda was softer on China. And I think there's probably got to be a little bit of play around there at some level of what Abe begins thinking about how you begin doing it. If China just stays bent on building a deep navy, pressing out, doing more and more, Japan's going to have to figure out a different game that's less dependent on the United States, and I think that's really tough. So I don't have any good vision there. So maybe I should just be quiet. But do think about the moral hazard thing, because I think it's interesting.
I think I'd like to have the last question, if I might. You're inside the Beltway, so we've seen the Clinton dynasty now, I guess you could say mortally wounded.
Yeah.
You see Obama's out of the picture, of course, and you had these voices of Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and so on, very loud, and all now seems to have just disappeared.
Yeah.
So are they kind of just gobsmacked in corridors, or trying to just comprehend what's going on, or is there some rising star that they're being talked about in the Democratic side?
It's a great question. I think about it almost every day lately, because you're beginning to see in this time people beginning to try to define themselves as potential players. So, look, in this game you realize that we all need to be humble, and I want to be humble because I don't know who will catch the fancy. I certainly would never have predicted Bernie Sanders in the past, and maybe he'll be back, but his sizzle seems to be gone for right now. Elizabeth Warren is trying hard to stay in the news, trying to stay out there, but she appeals to a much narrower group of people than one would think possible to take on the party and Trump. Joe Biden is older, but he is purposely not saying he won't run. He made that point over and over and over again in meetings that I had with him and saw, as to be an elder who can help raise a new generation of people and bless them. You have Cory Booker, who's made a play of going to all these airports, the senator from New Jersey, African-American, very compelling, talks too long like me, but he's out there trying to define himself. You have Amy Klobuchar from Midwest, who is a more rounded out major leader. She wants to run for president has been open about that. But none of these are household names. None of them are people that you would think tomorrow, if you're going to jump out. And then you've had these fantasy calls for people like Mark Zuckerberg to run Facebook and others, that maybe you match businessman with businessman, old generation, young generation, open society, closed society. It's not in this world where you just don't know what's going to happen. I think it was Mohammed Al-Arian in a recent book who said we're living at a time where all the kind of probabilities of things that would normally happen are the things that are best to bet against right now, and that the really weird stuff that's at the tails of the bell curve, that's where to place your bets. And so Mark Zuckerberg idea, while it may sound crazy to us at this moment, that one of the richest people in the world and youngest and most difficult to work with, if you watch the Social Network movie, might run, but it's not an entirely crazy idea. But among leading Democrats right now in the field, there's just no one that appears super popular. But times change, currents change, and someone will emerge. But it's just not clear who that will be now. Okay. And it's depressing. But you said to me, can I mention one other thing? You talked about the Hillary Clinton franchise and Bill Clinton franchises. This is the other thing that I think hasn't been written about from a media perspective yet. And I do see it as a constraint on Trump. Barack Obama took over the Tom Daschle franchise. And you had out there the Ted Kennedy franchise, which got merged in to Obama, much to the frustration of the Clintons. You had the John Edwards small franchise, but nonetheless, each one of these players had groups of people over the years that they got jobs for, helped move their political machine of people that were in different parts of government, whether they were civil service or political appointees, whether they were around the states, was huge. The Kennedys was probably the biggest. The Clintons had their own franchise, and when Hillary came into Obama land, as I said, Hillary land and Obama land, gently touched up, Obama never really got her franchise. That franchise of people largely remained connected in the Clinton Global Initiative, and it was that franchise that was running and animating her candidacy. But their unwillingness to sort of play nicely with a lot of other players in Obama was also a stumble for their campaign. And now they're largely wrecked. What's interesting in contrast to Trump is he has no one. He has zero. There are no roots at all to the Trump. There are no people that exist anywhere in the system that are actually always loyal to him. And so the chances for leaks, challenges, right now there are more and more secret. They love WikiLeaks. Wait, they're going to have lots and lots and lots of equivalent lights of things, because there's very little loyalty baked into the system by Trump. And that's why I think they use intimidation, fear, harassment of their own crowd so much. But it's one of the things, I think it was a very interesting way you framed the question, because I think that is also going to prove to be an interesting story potentially on something that doesn't go well for Trump, is his inability. That's why they'll continue to operate like a cabal, because a cabal is all they've got, to a certain degree. And so they're going to use tactics that a cabal would use to try to remain powerful, but it's going to be very different than what an Obama or a Daschle or a Ted Kennedy might have done running, with so many thousands of people that were responsible for their jobs from them. So.
Okay. On that note, I think we can conclude that having journalists hold press conferences is a pretty good idea. So my final act here is to give you a one-year honorary membership of the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan.
Thank you.
So thank you very much.
Does that mean
Thank
I
you.
can have a beer? Thank you very much. How to Build an Autocracy. I have one copy.